Well, I appreciate the invitation to come here and also to collaborate with Lonnie and Ellen on research, ongoing research. I became aware of the work, of course, through the foundational research on the Calcaya ice cores and began to pay attention to the paleoclimatic implications of cultural response to paleoclimatological events, and began with my own research group to do sediment cores in Lake Titicaca to begin to get a second archive, as it were, of climate change and environmental transformation, more broadly speaking, in the area of Lake Titicaca. And as Lonnie mentioned, more recently our group has begun work in both historical and archaeological context in northern Cambodia, in the society of Angkor, the great temple and city complex, perhaps the largest pre-industrial urban complex in the world, as well as extending our environmental history research into the contemporary sphere. We're now looking at the impact of dams that are being constructed along the course of the Mekong River from Thailand down Laos, down through Cambodia to the delta, the lower Mekong Delta to the South China Sea, looking at really implications of the interaction of humans on the landscape, the development of large hydrological phenomena, dams as well, and the issues of climate issues such as changing monsoon patterns. So that's sort of a general intellectual trajectory of the last decade. Now, this particular talk for today is actually based on something I developed at the request of UNESCO when in Paris, where I was last year, and one of the problems is how science gets intersected with politics, happily and unhappily, and in this case rather unhappily. This, as you may recall, or if you don't, you will now learn that the US decided, because of the Palestinian situation, of the UN recognizing, or the UNESCO recognizing the Palestinians as members in that body, the US summarily cut off funding to their part of UNESCO. So that's 30% of the budget. And the end result of that is this paper was stillborn because the conference was canceled. There was no money to bring people there. And so I thought this may be a good point to pilot this paper. So you'll be the first ones, rather than the bureaucrats and the scientists and the people at UNESCO that would have listened to this. I'll pilot it here and ask for your input and critique. So this is about one dimension of our work, and as you see here, it's about the notion of extreme droughts, both in the historical context and in the contemporary and future scenarios. And so what I focus on here is a phenomenon of extreme droughts, or what has been called colloquially in the literature mega droughts, that are basically geospatially extensive, multi-decadal to century-scale desiccation events that have occurred repeatedly throughout Earth history. So that's part of the issue here, is these are multi-decadal events. They're not simple droughts of a year or two. We're talking about long-term droughts, and they are geospatially rather extensive. Now, these extensive or extreme droughts, or mega droughts I'll call them here, are frequently linked with catastrophic flooding in regions distant from those experiencing desiccation. Historically, social and economic impacts of multi-decadal droughts, especially in Latin America, Asia, and sub-Saharan Africa, have crippled agricultural production systems, undermined rural livelihoods, and compromised regional food security, causing large-scale human mortality and inducing population migrations that further destabilize social systems, both within and beyond regions directly affected by chronic drought. And here I'll give you two examples of this, historical examples in more detail, and then move on to briefly citing a few historical instances and what this might mean for the future, for us in the contemporary world. Emerging scientific evidence for repeated worldwide occurrence of extreme droughts and their devastating impacts on human societies presents, I believe, a compelling case that greater attention must be paid to this phenomenon. there is increasingly robust evidence for a connection between such mega droughts and global ocean atmosphere circulation patterns that in the context of accelerating global warming could intensify the frequency, severity, and duration of such droughts. Research on human responses to such phenomena must be a high priority for global governance institutions. That's a line directed to UNESCO. Given the spatially extensive implications of climate extremes in the contemporary world. So here what I want to do today is briefly describe two occurrences of century scale on the one hand and multi-decadal droughts on the other that we have empirically documented, one that affected the Andean Altiplano during the mid-12th to 15th century, and the other, a series of multi-decadal events that affected large portions of Southeast Asia during the 14th and 15th century. So these are essentially medieval events, if you will, in the European-based chronology. They're basically mid-12th to mid-15th century we'll be looking at here. Now, each of these mega droughts compromised, clearly, this is our archaeological and historical research, compromised the complex groundwater-dependent hydraulic infrastructure of a major pre-industrial civilization. On the one hand, Lonnie mentioned that of Tiahuanaco in the Andean Altiplano, you see here in this image around Lake Titicaca, and the other, the Khmer Empire, centered at the Angkor conurbation in northern Cambodia, which I'll talk about here briefly later on. In both cases, the impact of chronic drought conditions contributed clearly to urban decline, to population migration, and in both cases, actually, to civilizational collapse. After presenting the evidence from these two case studies, I will return to the Andean Altiplano to examine the specific effects of a historically documented El Nino, something you're probably all familiar with, the 1982-83 ENSO event that induced drought conditions persisting for approximately 3 years. Although relatively short, 3-year duration does not qualify that event as a so-called mega drought, the devastating socioeconomic impacts and human response to this severe drought as it played out in Bolivia serves for us as a proxy for enumerating the catastrophic potential of mega droughts in the contemporary world. And in closing, I will briefly reflect on the possibilities for and limitations of human adaptation to a mega drought. I think something that people are not aware of here in our contemporary moment when a 250-year drought in California may not be thinkable, although empirically demonstrable in the past. It's something that our politicians and most people could not even imagine what a relative drought of that scope, of that extent, of that depth chronologically might do to agricultural systems, even in our contemporary connected, logistically complex world as opposed to the medieval past. And reflections on future scenarios, if you will, of adaptation and response to such an extensive climate-driven disaster should give us pause and will certainly call into question the efficacy of any of our current tools for managing and mitigating disaster. And that's what this conference would have been about, is how do we mitigate disasters in the contemporary world. So let's take a quick look at the first mega drought that we documented. Entailed a period of intense, persistent desiccation in the Andean Altiplano. And many of you, of course, are familiar with the general region here. And down below in that image is Coipasa Basin, Lake Poopó, a much larger lake in the past, of course, the entire area, a single lake, but now we have Lake Titicaca to the north and Poopó, and the lithium beds, great lithium beds of the Salares in the Uyuni salt flats down to the south. And here is just a conventional satellite image of the region, so you get a sense of where we're situated geomorphologically, if you will. And then here, of course, just a map, a locational map with both the Calcaya ice cap generically indicated at Lake Titicaca and this particular civilization that I worked on for many years, Tiahuanaco, pre-Inca civilization, basically from 200 BC to about 1150 AD is the time frame for the development of this complex society. And the 1150 AD is a marker, it's a marker of collapse, and it is directly related to our evidence based on Lonnie's work and a lot of the work here, actually on what is the paleoclimate record for the Kalkaya record and our own parallel independent archive from Lake Titicaca, obviously going back perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 years there, but concentrating on this medieval period in particular. So our data show that this period of desiccation in this area lasted over 2 centuries, from about 1150 in the Common Era to about 1375, marked again by fluctuating interannual variation in rainfall. Now, evidence of severe drought signatures, again, derives obviously principally from the ice cores extracted from Calcaya in southern Peru, as well as, again, as I mentioned, from our sediment cores extracted from Lake Titicaca by my research collaborators, Michael Binford, Mark Brenner, and Jason Curtis at the University of Florida. Now, this persistent medieval period drought resulted from an estimated, by our water budget models, 15% average annual reduction in precipitation in the Altiplano over the course of these 2 centuries. So then what effects did this great Altiplano drought have on the human population? Now, our team has argued in a set of several publications that this mega drought, in fact, induced the collapse of the largest and most complex pre-industrial civilization in the region, the indigenous Tiahuanaco state, again, this pre-Inca state, or pre-Inca empire, if you will. Over the course of some 500 years, Tiahuanaco's wealth and its food security depended directly on an economy of intensive agro-pastoral production. So this was a combination of pastoralism of llama and alpaca combined with intensive agricultural production, which is something that was not anticipated in this high altitude environment. And by high altitude, I mean here about 3,800 to 4,000 meters is the range we work in when we look at the agro-ecosystems of this civilization. Intensive and highly productive agricultural production on what have become called and are globally distributed in different forms for different reasons, raised agricultural fields, stimulated human population growth and sustained dense populations, particularly in the period from AD 600 or 600 of the Common Era forward. But by AD 1150, population, and so that by AD 1150, population in the Tiahuanaco core area of about 3 valleys was at least an order of magnitude greater than it is today. Our biological work have indicated, in fact, this sustaining area sustained a population anywhere from 200,000 to 700,000 people based on our demographic projections, whereas today it may be 40 or 50,000. So there's a major difference in the, shall we say, the capacity of this particular environment to sustain population that is not being realized today. It's simply not sustained as it was in the past. So in sum, large pre-industrial urban and rural populations had become dependent upon a particular agricultural configuration, and you see that here in this image, these raised field systems that, and this is the critical point, relied on abundant groundwater for their productivity and continued viability. This is not irrigation, open channel irrigation system. This is principally groundwater-driven agriculture. And here you see an image, and in this image, I'm on your far left, and it's Mark Brenner and Mike Binford here. I just wanted to point out my collaborators here, and we are in fact looking out over these vast extents of a corrugated landscape, and here you can see the image. Those are actually fields, ancient fields, and they're dated from 600 AD to 1100 AD, almost across this entire landscape. We ran many dates, we extracted many samples, and so we know that this agroecological system was developed, how long it lasted, and then it was abandoned suddenly, relatively suddenly in this period around 1150 AD. And here you can see how vast that landscape it is. And if you look as well here, you can see just pretty clearly, I hope clearly, images of a few sheep, and that's basically, and a few cattle and some small-scale dry field agriculture here. And that's all that goes on today. And here you get a close-up picture of what these fields look like, abandoned fields. This particular field dated from 900 AD to about 1100 AD. You can see some salt wicking on the surface. You can see a canal, a raised field, a canal, and this goes on for hectares and hectares. In fact, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of hectares of relic fields that we're looking at here. And then here you get a sense of how these fields worked, and this is just a quick image from an actual computer model that's much more elaborate than this, that shows the thermal properties of these fields. The real benefit of these fields is that the canals absorb this solar radiation that then radiates out over the field at night and prevents one of the major vectors of agricultural damage here, shall we say, lack of productivity, is frost damage. 3 out of 5 years there's major frost damage in this area, but the raised fields act as, in a way, as a solar blanket. They elevate ambient temperatures, and these raised fields do another thing. And here again, it's a simplified model of the agro-ecosystem in which you can see that the canals also serve another function, which is they address the problem of nutrient-poor soils, which the Altiplano is relatively lacking in, nitrogen particularly as well. NPK, basically nitrogen is limited here, and these raised fields and the canals serve as a kind of, if you will, colloquially speaking, a little fertilizer factory. As you can see the cycles here capturing atmospheric N2 by virtue of the fact that the canals are colonized by a particular plant, an azolla, a water fern, that serves to capture and make biologically available atmospheric nitrogen. So you have N2 fixation, and the system essentially works as a self-sustaining agro-ecosystem, but it is completely dependent on the water, on the hydrological system. And here you can see what those fields look like. Again, if you go back to this is actually what you're looking at here is the same field here, only from a different perspective. And here you can see when you actually rehabilitate these fields, when you bring them back online into production, they in fact are extraordinarily productive, as we demonstrated in some papers, exactly how productive they are, probably 3 to 4 times more productive than conventional dry farming. And here you see some of our community members harvesting potatoes on these raised fields. Some of these fields, in fact, produced 8 times the production of dry farming that goes on in most of this region of the Altiplano. So this was the system. This was the core agroecological system that powered this demographic expansion, the development of this complex urban-based society that we call Tiahuanaco. And part of the research project that we did was essentially trying to determine when these fields were developed, and then more specifically when they essentially went offline, and they go offline for what reason? Because we know that they simply were not by our trench work, and you see here the radiocarbon dated trenches, we were able to determine that there's not a field that is in production, is constructed or used after about 1150 AD. So we know there's a marker. Something major happened. There's simply a cessation of this, and the first thing one thinks of is a water-dependent system. There must have been some water scarcity, and what is driving that turns out again to be the emergence of this long-term mega drought. And here you can see we have our own sediment core on the far right. Then we have the snow accumulation here based on the Calcaya core. This is, of course, much older stuff published in the 90s. I know there's new data now. I'm sure this could all be calibrated much more wonderfully. But this gives you a idea of the raised field radiocarbon dates, and you can see the dashed line running across. It shows the point of collapse, and it's related to this major desiccation event that goes on for a long period of time. In fact, 2 centuries. So we're talking about a century scale desiccation event rather than a decadal one. So after the mid-12th century, as you see up here, increased aridity in the Altiplano induced declining agricultural production, progressive raised field abandonment, population dispersal, and ultimately Tiahuanaco cultural collapse. In particular, groundwater-dependent raised field systems that I've just showed you here that had provided substantial food security and surplus production for exchange over centuries began to fail with the sustained decline of the water table. Again, this is groundwater dependent. The loss of more than 100,000 hectares of raised fields dealt a devastating blow to Tiahuanaco's agrarian economy. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that the capital city was rapidly abandoned after 1150, with human populations denucleating, deurbanizing, and migrating to other ecoclimatic zones, particularly, as it turns out, to the more humid eastern slopes of the Andes. In other words, there was a movement actually down towards the Amazonian climate system, away from the Altiplano system. We see right at this time expansion of archaeological evidence on the other side of the Andean chain precisely at this time, suggesting significant environmental refugeeism, in short, is what was going on here. Accompanying urban decline, there is prima facie evidence as well of social violence directed at the elite inhabitants of the political capital, reflected in massive burning episodes at the same time within the capital city of this pre-industrial state of Tiahuanaco, and the razing of elite residents. Entire elite complexes are simply razed. And there are also evidences, again, for population denucleation. In short, human response to this mega drought entailed deurbanization, social violence, population dispersal, and migration to other more salubrious ecological zones. After the mid-12th century onset of this drought and the environmentally induced collapse of the Tiahuanaco state, human settlement patterns in the formerly productive agricultural heartland that I showed you some images of reverted to very small, less than 1 hectare sized, dispersed occupations having no direct association with the raised fields. Now, some alternate hypotheses about the timing of the end of raised field cultivation, such as Greg Grafham's argument that Little Ice Age, late 15th to the 19th century, temperature decline ended raised fields, are simply not supported by our data because there are absolutely no radiocarbon dates for raised field surfaces from construction or use context that occur after AD 1200. So social upheaval may have accompanied the drying-induced decline in agricultural output. Not only did the people of Tiahuanaco stop cultivating raised fields, they also abandoned their urban centers, as I've suggested. There is no evidence whatsoever of monumental construction projects or other indices of urban life in the region for nearly 300 years after the AD 1150 collapse. Populations dispersed throughout the rural landscape and colonized new environmental niches, unoccupied during the Tiahuanaco florescence. The drier climate and much smaller lake of this period would have created a harsher environment similar to that of the contemporary Altiplano south of the Tiahuanaco heartland around Lake Popo, where mineral extraction and pastoralism rather than agriculture are the principal economic activities. In addition to dispersal, some measure of population decline on the Altiplano may have been an element of the adaptation to changed environmental conditions, but demographic data for this time period are insufficiently resolved to provide very precise quantitative measures. So, the second case study I want to move to now is, and here again we see this 15, this is a very early publication, again, could be much better calibrated now, but you get an idea of that 1150 drop in mean rainfall. That's related to that 15% reduction by our water budget models in precipitation in the region. So it's a dramatic, and then year to year, obviously wrainfall highly variable, but you can see overall it's a substantial shift, and it lasts again for that period. Now this is the second drought I want to look at, the second region, and this is the Angkor Basin in Cambodia. Now this second case study of mega droughts, actually I might put the light on here if I could. I would appreciate that. Since I have this text here, it's good if I could see it. Well, anyway, oh, that's perfect, great. The second case study, again, of mega drought occurrences and impacts involves an entirely different environmental and cultural region. This is Southeast Asia, where currently we have been conducting research over the past decade. Specifically, our work is focused on both historical ecology, contemporary human-environmental interactions in Cambodia and Thailand, as well as this archaeological research into the paleo-environmental interactions of humans over time. So from the 9th to the 15th century, the city and temple complex of Angkor, and here you can see perhaps where it's situated, and right here is the temple complex of Angkor, and here you get a better view of it from this image with the great Tonle Sap Lake, and here you see the site. This is the temple of Angkor Wat itself. This is the Angkor complex. It goes over many square kilometers. And this feature here in particular is of interest. That is the Western Barai. A Barai is a giant artificial reservoir. This was built, we have it dated, we know which king of Angkor built it, we know when it was built, so we have perfect chronological control. And this thing is about 8 kilometers long, 1 kilometer across, and it has an artificial island here with a temple. And it is one of the several barais or reservoirs, artificial reservoirs that service the center of Angkor here with a whole series as well of collateral canals, a whole, if you will, grid of an agroecological grid that is difficult to pick up here, but when you have other images, remotely sensed images, you can see individual rice fields that were part of this whole reservoir irrigation complex here. And I think you can see some of the canals actually coming off here from the mountains back here. So from the 9th to the 15th century, the city and temple complex of Angkor was the seat of the Khmer Empire in Cambodia. Angkor is famously noted for its monumental architecture, its beautiful temples, and also, my particular interest, the complex hydro-engineering system comprised, again, of canals, moats, embankments, and these large reservoirs known as barais. Now, we inferred, our most recent publication just out in PNAS this year, we inferred a 1,000-year radiocarbon-dated paleo-environmental record from the study of a 2-meter sediment core taken in that western barai you see here. The barai was utilized and managed from the time of construction in the early 11th century by a particular king through the 13th century. So that's the time period we know it was in operation. During that time, the West Barai received relatively high rates of detrital input. In the 14th century, linear sedimentation rates diminished by an order of magnitude, yielding a condensed section that you can see here, a condensed section right there, yielding a condensed section that correlates temporally, in the 14th, during this time the West Barai received relatively high rates of detrital input in the 14th century. Linear sedimentation rates diminished by an order of magnitude, yielding a condensed section that correlates temporally with episodes of regional monsoon failure during the late 14th and early 15th century that are recorded in tree ring records from Vietnam. So it's in that late 14th and early 15th century period that you see here, the Angkor Droughts on this image, that the Angkorian kingdom and empire dissolved in that period and was essentially replaced by the kingdom of Siam and a number of other political events that occur at this time. Now, the West Barai sediment record displays changes in response to 3 known drought intervals in the early 13th, and you see those up here, in the early 13th, the 14th and 15th century, or the Angkor droughts, and the middle to the late 18th century, including the strange parallels, as you see here, in East India droughts. During these, and again, we have the Vietnam tree ring records that are the independent archive here as well, that correlates with our own sediment core from the Western Barai. During these 3 periods, both organic carbon content and carbon-nitrogen ratios increase. West Barai sediments deposited during drought episodes are likely richer in organic matter because of reduced input of detrital sediment and water to the Barai. Sediment composition, color, and density are controlled by the relative contribution of autochthonous or limnetic sediments and allochthonous or detrital sediments. The radiocarbon chronology of the core does not provide the resolution needed to determine whether sedimentation rates decrease during each of the 3 drought intervals. But the linear sedimentation and mass accumulation rates for the relatively organic rich horizon during and after the Angkor droughts, however, is much lower than rates during the remainder of the record, suggesting a large reduction in sediment delivery to the Barai at this time. So what does this all mean? Well, our evidence suggests that Angkor's water management system may have been insufficient to cope with changing hydrological conditions. Alterations, breaches, and failures within the network have been documented and hint at a deterioration of the hydraulic infrastructure, much as we've seen for the Tiahuanaco case of a deterioration of the hydrological system, of the hydraulic infrastructure. The tree ring records from Vietnam indicate extended periods of severe drought, punctuated, again, not surprisingly, by unusually rainy intervals during the late 14th and early 15th century. Such intense variability in multi-decadal precipitation may have overwhelmed the capabilities of the water management network. Intense droughts occurred during the transition from the relatively wet medieval climate anomaly to the drier Little Ice Age, and were associated with a southward shift of the intertropical convergence zone, as well as El Nino-like warming of the tropical Pacific Ocean. Monsoon intensity in Southeast Asia, including mega droughts, have been linked to tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures throughout the last millennium. Failure of the hydraulic network during a period of extreme rainfall variation may have been a principal factor in the decline of Angkor. So like in the Tiahuanaco case, we're looking at what we would call an environmental threshold. At some point, it becomes simply not flexible enough, not resilient enough to adapt to these changes, either extended droughts or these kind of extreme rainfall variation. And the result is essentially a decline, a degradation of the capacity of the agroecological system in its sustainability, if you will. And we see at this period of the Angkor decline, like in the case of Tiahuanaco in that medieval period, the city was depopulated, though not entirely abandoned at that time, as the large-scale hydraulic infrastructure ceased to function and populations dispersed, again, like in the Tiahuanaco case, in this case, however, toward southern Cambodia and coastal regions. Now, other Asian monsoon failures and mega droughts over the past millennium have been documented with the recent development of the Monsoon Asia Drought Atlas. For instance, the East India drought, you see up here on this image, the East India drought of 1790 to 1796 occurred during the persistent, large-scale, intense El Nino of the late 18th century, which was experienced worldwide, resulting in widespread civic unrest and socioeconomic turmoil, as well as population instability in India and elsewhere. Similarly, what is called the late Victorian Great Drought of 1876 to 1878 occurred during one of the most severe El Nino events of the past 150 years. The effects of this devastating drought were felt across much of the tropics and were particularly acute in China and India. And here we have the historical record. In China alone, agricultural production effectively collapsed as in a 1 million kilometer square area of 9 provinces, and an estimated 9 million people died in the subsequent famine. As Cook and others have pointed out, rural rebellions in Vietnam against the French colonial regime took place, and here's a direct quote, as a consequence of severe drought and famine at this time. And the drought was felt as far away as Jakarta, Borneo, and New Guinea. More than 30 million people are thought to have died from famine worldwide, and colonial era imperialism left regional societies ill-equipped to deal with the effects of drought. So here's where we get the nexus of politics, human interaction, social structures, history, and environmental change, all coming together in a catastrophic situation of mortality of 30 million people, of population dislocation, of environmental refugeeism. So you can see where we're going with respect to this in the contemporary world, which is where I want to go now, to look at an implication of this in the contemporary world. So to do that, we can explicitly quantify the impacts and human response to severe drought by examining in more detail the 1982-83 El Nino event, which was again a significant global climate milestone. During this 2-year interval, ENSO effects were felt in Indonesia, the Philippines, northeastern Australia, India, southern and central Africa, Spain, and virtually all of the Western Hemisphere, but especially in the Andean region and northeastern Brazil. In the case of Bolivia, which I want to get back to, this El Nino caused 2 complementary phenomena. Prolonged drought, again, in the Altiplano and the Interandean valleys in the Chaco regions, and an excess of rain in the Amazon forest, causing catastrophic, though relatively short-term flooding. The drought of 82-83 was undoubtedly the effect that had the greatest impact. Now, what were the consequences, the human consequences that we can document of this 1982-83 El Nino-driven drought for Bolivia? Well, in a short one word, they were devastating. Specifically, impact indicators include the following statistics worth noting. The drought affected 38% of Bolivia's territory, almost the entire high plateau, or Altiplano, 70% of the Interandean valleys, and 10% of the lowlands, mainly in the Chaco region. Living conditions for 1.6 million people in rural areas, 60% of whom lived in the departments of Potosí, Cochabamba, and Oruro, deteriorated. 85% of the potato crop and 50% of quinoa and broad bean crops were lost. A large, although not empirically enumerated, number of livestock died, substantially undermining rural livelihoods and leading again to drought-induced migration or environmental refugeeism. National average calorie consumption, which stood at approximately 2,100 calories per day before the drought, fell dramatically to 1,200 calories per day. So we're talking about serious impacts right away that we've been able to document what this climate shift did to this society in this brief 2-year period. So imagine what that, when we're talking about these extended droughts, these so-called mega droughts that I've been referring to. Total economic losses for Bolivia were estimated to amount to $400 million, which is trivial for us, but a lot for Bolivia at that time. We're talking about a significant impact. National farm income in Bolivia fell by 22%, while national GDP plummeted by 8%. Food security was significantly compromised, and the Bolivian government was forced to import basic foodstuffs at a cost of $150 million US. And then rural outmigration increased drastically, although precise population numbers remain unquantified. Now, the impact of the drought was felt most acutely in the department of Potosí, where conditions of desiccation and water shortages persisted until 1985, so we're adding another couple of years. The agricultural cycle in this large region was disrupted and seed stores disappeared. The response of the inhabitants of northern Potosí was mass migration in 2 directions. First, to the large cities of La Paz, Cochabamba, and Santa Cruz, as well as farther afield to Buenos Aires, where you probably know there are a lot of this huge Bolivian Aymara Indian population to this day, where migrants attempted to establish an urban-based livelihood. And secondly, to rural areas of the department of Santa Cruz to work on sugar plantations or to acquire land in an entirely different agroecological context, as well as, and not trivially, to see how climate affects politics, including implicating the Drug Enforcement Agency. A substantial part of the population migrated to the department of Chapare, that is to the Cochabamba region, where many migrants began cultivating coca and incorporating themselves into the clandestine cocaine economy. And this is where I first met, in fact, Evo Morales, who was the president of Bolivia, the indigenous president of Bolivia, who was then a labor organizer in this Chapare district. So it shows you how these unexpected connections, teleconnections, if you will, of climate and human populations generate a massive transformation of society. Now, although some migrants returned to northern Potosi after 1985 with the alleviation of drought conditions to reclaim their own land, a substantial, but again, as yet not precisely documented proportion of migrants became permanent environmental refugees, swelling the populations of cities already experiencing social and environmental problems associated with a lack of adequate infrastructure such as sanitary water supplies to accommodate urban populations. Now, as a marginal comment, these impacts do not, of course, take into account the staggering economic impacts on other world regions affected by this event, nor the long-term effects on the local Bolivian society, such as the emergence of hyperinflation as a partial outcome of food shortages and imports of essential commodities resulting from drought-induced economic imbalances. That is, the aggregate global impact of the 1982-1983 ENSO event was even more dour and economically costly than these incomplete statistics from a small country indicate. So what then can we think about if we have these instances of medieval droughts affecting pre-industrial societies heavily dependent on complex hydraulic infrastructures, agricultural infrastructures? What does that mean for us? Is this simply an interesting historical case, or are there lessons to be learned? And of course, the argument I would make is there are serious lessons to be learned about the possibility of mega droughts and what that might mean for our own contemporary society. So if we extrapolate economic and social impact indicators from the 82-83 El Nino event in the Andean Altiplano onto a true multi-decadal or century-scale drought, as we've seen in Tiahuanaco and Angkor, we can readily perceive that the catastrophic long-term impact on production systems and rural livelihoods of such a chronic climate event would render any short-term humanitarian intervention from the international community ineffective at best and most likely counterproductive by needless expenditure of scarce resources. In any future mega drought scenarios, likely human response will entail, as in the two pre-industrial case studies I talked about briefly here, mass migration to more favorable environmental zones. Unlike these pre-industrial cases, such migration will probably not result in deurbanization, as we've seen, or abandonment or state collapse, but rather the opposite, hyperurbanization, as environmental refugees move to cities in search of non-agricultural livelihood. So this is a massive shift in agricultural livelihood and in population distributions. The more complex, more diversified economic structure of contemporary post-industrial society may mitigate some of the worst negative impacts of a mega drought. However, the prospect of high mortality, chronic famine, massive population dislocation, political instability, and widespread social violence remains a possible outcome, maybe even a predictable outcome. And in certain local areas, it's already an outcome. You know, the famous cases of water wars in Bolivia and in other areas of the world. Water is one of the major issues, of course, resource allocation issues that we will face in the contemporary world over the course of the next generation. Without too much question, I think there's certainly consensus on that. Moreover, conurbations shorn of their, that is large metropolitan areas, shorn of their productive agricultural hinterlands will themselves begin to experience significant social and infrastructural stress under the impact of burgeoning migrant populations or environmental refugees and the need to import food and other basic commodities once produced in closer proximity to the urban core. Again, compromising environmental sustainability by, of course, having to import from long distance food rather than producing it relatively close in. So that is, contemporary populations, particularly those resident in richer countries with more efficient, diversified economies, may be less vulnerable to an emergent mega drought by virtue of access to more financial resources and technological capacity to adapt to such a long-term climate event, but they are certainly not immune. to dire agroecological and water resource consequences of a multi-decadal drought. And I like to use this thought experiment here to drive this point home. And that is, we can only imagine what the devastating socioeconomic consequences of a multi-decadal drought affecting, say, California's irrigation-dependent Imperial Valley would be. The impact on the agricultural labor force, on interdependent commodity chains, on environmental resources would be nothing short of catastrophic, leading perhaps even to a reverse Dust Bowl-like outmigration of populations in search of a livelihood denied. If short-term humanitarian interventions such as temporary food and aid would be inefficacious and even counterproductive, how then should the international community respond to the inevitable scenario of future mega droughts? Well, that of course remains an open question and one desperately in search of a systematic solution. One approach is to seek a suite of responses to the mega drought scenario derives from ethnographic inquiry. And here you have a table, part of our analysis of local perceptions of change and possible adaptation measures. I won't go over this directly. You can see some of the linkages there. One example, again, is this table from questionnaires and focus group interviews from indigenous populations that, in fact, were affected by the 82-83 ENSO event in the Bolivian Altiplano. Here we see the climatic perceptions of local populations on the left here, matched against potential adaptation responses. These responses can be classified under the general rubric of what I call anticipatory infrastructure. Anticipatory infrastructure would entail significant global investments in irrigation systems adapted to hyper-drought conditions, systematic development of improved seed stock, drought-resistant crops and livestock, and expansion into new agroecological habitats. But development of anticipatory infrastructure, particularly in zones of high risk and containing the most vulnerable populations, will generate new environmental and social costs, fierce intra- and inter-societal competition, and most likely accelerating economic inequalities unless such infrastructure could be designated a basic human right and global public good under international law. And here's where we get to the issue of global civics. And this, of course, is difficult in a world of high competition to imagine an international law framework that would essentially be an investment pool for anticipatory infrastructure in areas that are clearly going to be vulnerable to climate change, to mega droughts of the scope and scale we're talking about here. So in the end, we must recognize the possibility that a severe multi-decadal or century-scale drought of great spatial magnitude may exceed the capacity of even the most sophisticated technological interventions currently available. In this scenario, vast tracts of once productive agricultural lands will be abandoned, perhaps over multiple generations. We can then only focus on social rather than technical or technological interventions to accommodate environmental refugees who will seek relief across regional, national, and hemispheric boundaries. Most of these refugees will look to resettle in the megacities of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Mega droughts, in other words, will further concentrate humanity in our already dense urban centers. Therefore, in terms of social adaptations, our attention must focus on enhancing the livability and economic opportunities for displaced populations in our cities. So that is essentially one of the scenarios, that the hyper-urbanization that people find to be perhaps intolerable may in fact need to be made, shall we say, more livable, that this is a likely outcome of the occurrence of these kinds of mega droughts. Now, quickly, and that I'll just end the presentation, except quickly, I wanted to go back to just one dimension of this that I haven't had a chance to refer to here. I'll just go quickly to a couple of images I left for you without explanation. I hate doing that. So I want to just show you these images here. And this has to do with our work on, again, from Cambodia. And if I can get that image to come up properly. Anyway, this gives you an idea of some of our work with satellite imagery of land cover from a period from '89 to 2005 that shows a bit about the interrelationship of human impact on the landscape and how this will intensify the effects of a drought. And here I think is a better image you can see here of deforestation story. This is a story of deforestation over a period from '89 to 2005. And that red zone there you can see on that image is basically the zone of forestation in 1995. And by 2005, it was simply deforested. And this was a phenomenon of tourism. Basically, as people began to, as Cambodia opened up, as Angkor became a great tourist destination, the forests came down. They used the forest for furniture, they used the forest for cooking, and part of the problem here is, of course, those forests served as great absorbers of regulators of the groundwater regime, and now in the area up here in the north here along the mountain ranges there where the water provided for the ancient agricultural system of Angkor, that water now runs on the surface rather than percolating into the groundwater. It runs on the surface all the way down to the Tonle Sap Lake. So that is, in fact, generating an even more dire scenario, even in the context of a mega drought. It will make living conditions in this area even that much more difficult. And it is doing precisely already what I suggested these hyper or mega droughts will do in the future. And that is, there is substantial amounts in our own survey work here of documentation of environmental refugees from this area of deforestation moving into Siem Reap, moving into Phnom Penh, in fact, many moving to Bangkok, essentially out-migrating to the larger cities because the livelihood is compromised by this nexus between human interaction, human action on the landscape, and this ongoing and continuing and intensifying climate change with episodic mega droughts. So I think I'll just end it there and see if you have any questions.
So if you have any questions.
Or commentary. Oh, yeah.
Not a scientific one. What was your impression of Evo Morales personally?
Oh, but this is a great story. I mean, he was very young then. I happened to run into him when I was down in Chapare, and I was quite impressed with him in the sense that I work with Aymara groups, and there's a lot of separatists. There's a lot of radical separatists who believe that the Aymara land is theirs. It should be a separate nation. Evo Morales was a little bit more pragmatic. He's a lot more pragmatic person than one would imagine. He comes across in certain contexts. He's a brilliant politician in this way. He's able to speak to certain constituencies pretty pragmatically, reasonably, and then still forward the interests of the indigenous population. Now you can tell that he is a good politician to the extent that there are many indigenous people I know who are part of the more, shall we say, radical group of separatists who believe he is a traitor to the Aymara nation, and there are those people who believe on the other end of the spectrum who believe that he is a radical separatist. So he has multiple personalities apparently depending on your perspective. But he's a very dynamic guy, very dynamic, very and very keyed in. Even then in the, this was the early 80s, even then he was keyed into what was going on in the global sphere, and he was thinking about how the indigenous population of Bolivia could adapt to this changing globalization that he saw coming on, and how could they capture some of the economic benefit of increasing integration with the modern economy. So yeah, I mean, it's a great question, actually. It's part of what you do when you get in the field. Is, I mean, you meet all sorts of interesting people, and I just happened to, my brush with fame. I was just telling Ilani, my other brush with fame is I live in Hyde Park in University of Chicago where I teach, and down the block from me is our president's house, literally a block and a half away from our house. And I play basketball on the same court, I can say that, my brush with fame, with Barack Obama. He's much better than I am, but he has a good jump shot. Yes, Ellen.
So you talked about maybe looking forward, enhancing the livability of urban centers, just recognizing or hopefully local governments or federal governments would recognize recognize this, but what do you think is really the likelihood that we would have such forethought and have the political will to do anything about it? Because, you know, we've already got significant evidence from the global climate change perspective that sea levels rising, you know, climate is going to become more variable, da 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 da, and nobody's taking it very seriously. What do you think?
Well, yeah.
Trying to get people to think about mega droughts and how you're going to handle these environmental refugees.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting because I once gave an interview to people out. I mentioned the Imperial Valley for a specific reason because it was a California station, and I was talking about, in this case, the Tiahuanaco drought, and saying, you know, droughts aren't something that happened a year or two. I remember a drought in California was like a 6-year drought, and people were, oh my God, we cannot keep our lawn green, and you know, we can't wash our cars and things like that. And of course, it was more serious than that as well, with access to municipal water. I said, yeah, but just think if that were a 30-year drought or a 50-year drought. What do you think that will do to this area? What do you expect it to do? And he was saying, well, we can always get water from the Great Lakes. So it was like, we use our political muscle to come here and grab our water and take it there, right? Which could happen. I mean, so that's the kind of things that this can stimulate. These, well, we can always figure it out. There's always a technical solution. But I agree with you. What is the prospect of it? This is more, I suppose, utopic. So, you know, like we have to come up with we need to make cities more livable. We need to have global governance, which no one, I mean, global governance is a horrible word for most people. It's a frightening idea because, of course, you don't want to cede your autonomy or sovereignty to anyone. But at some point, at climate thresholds, my argument would be, it's going to be so chaotic, and we see it in the historical record. Social violence in the pre-industrial period takes on a certain scale. In this society, you know, with nuclear powers and with scarce water, one can only imagine nightmare scenarios of conflict being escalated to the point of, you know, really serious violence on a scale. So where am I getting to? I'm going to an area where I actually, when I give a course related to this, I try to avoid apocalyptic visions because it's not, you know, it doesn't help very much to have, you know, my undergraduates telling them, well, you know, everything looks pretty bad and it's not getting better and there's no hope. That's not a good thing to say. But one then has to imagine what are the scenarios, which is where I began to think about, okay, these cities, these hyper cities of Asia, which many of you probably know very well and go to, are pretty awful places in general. I mean, they are very difficult to inhabit. They are not healthy places. Is there a way to somehow engineer a design component to cities that could provide a bit of a more sustainability? And ironically enough, and this again would politically not be well received in some quarters, my experience of going to Cuba in the mid-1990s to see how Havana was adjusting to the economic impact of our embargo, and to find all of these unexpected, being invited to apartment buildings, going up on the roof of apartment buildings and finding incredible farms up on the top of buildings with tubes connecting across neighborhoods. Literally this incredible ecosystem on top of old crumbling apartment buildings. And I began to realize, my God, this is auto construction. People are finding solutions with scarce resources and they're making their own. In this case, it was for you know, auto consumption to address the problem of lack of food. And they were doing it within the city. So I mean, I think there are kind of small scale solutions like this, but the problem I see is the problem of temporality, that the climate change issues and the environmental transformation issues just seems to be accelerating faster and faster. And there's not the political will to bring solutions to bear rapidly enough. And I'm a little concerned that more than a little concerned that these small scale auto invented adaptations are not going to be sufficient. Can you imagine? We have cities of what, 20 million people now? Can you imagine doubling that population from natural population growth, from in-migration? And in the Cambodia case you see here, Siem Reap, you know, this used to be a small, sleepy town. Obviously, it only opened up in 1992 to tourism. And in one 6-month period, there were 700 hotel rooms came online in one 6-month period. And the groundwater started to go like this because, of course, they're tapping it with wells. It's all groundwater. And ironically enough, the temples are collapsing because it's not like Manhattan on granite. It's on unconsolidated sediment. So the whole goose that lays the golden egg of ecotourism is collapsing because of this interconnected water system. And that is also part of the idea, the consciousness that we have to look beyond the small scale, the local scale. We have to think across borders. But again, as we all know, it's very difficult to get political movement on this. Which is why I was going to this conference in part, was to make these arguments, say, look, here's historical records, pay attention. It's not a, pre-industrial past is a real interesting record of very specific actions related to agroecological systems. We still need to have agroecological systems to support us and our cities. So it's not as if this is simply a charming historical event that we don't have to be concerned about. So that was the argument that I made, which I made in the halls, talking to people, but could not do the conference itself because, again, of the political problem of the lack of funding. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks. That was a great talk. The question I have also gets into this aspect of anticipatory infrastructure adaptation.
Right.
And I'm wondering also what the archaeological record can teach us about, I guess, the role of science,
mm-hmm.
And also instances where there might be winners amidst this sort of chaotic disruptions.
Yeah, I mean, those are great questions. And the term that I use here of anticipatory infrastructure actually comes up because in looking at a different cultural context altogether, and on the north coast of Peru, looking in this case in the 14th and 15th century, in an area, of course, we know the arid coast of Peru, dramatically affected by Niños, catastrophic flooding from time to time, etc. We realized in doing an archaeological analysis of an entire landscape on the north coast that there were 5 valleys interconnected, and that if you look at the human settlement system, there was a huge investment in surface flow canals, aqueducts, but those surface flow canals, aqueducts, reservoirs were all contemporary. We were able to document. They're all simultaneously built, but they could never. Were not intended to serve the entire population. They were not, in other words, brought online. They literally were building anticipatory infrastructure because they have a historical understanding that there will be droughts, there will be flooding, and they were able to bring on systems, parts of the valleys online in certain contexts, and take others out of line when they were washed out, and so they could rebuild. So it wasn't as if they were unaware. This is what the impression of these pre-industrial societies is that, well, they really don't have the technological skill or the grasp of it. In fact, this was exactly what I'm proposing we need to do. We have to think big, and we have to think of overinvestment in infrastructure, if you will, presumptive overinvestment or anticipatory infrastructure, precisely because we have these repetitive, in this case, climate events. And this particular society, Chamu, north coast of Peru, built this massive landscape of which only, I think we calculated something like 30% at any given time was actually online producing, which was more than enough. But the other 70% were held in reserve for events like this. And your question was more about, I guess, winners and losers. And that's certainly, this is the issue of inequalities as well. I think that's what's clearly going to be happening. In terms of, in a way, you can see it with people building gated communities and all of that. That really is a response to fear of what's happening out there. It's the anxiety of what is happening that we can't control. And if you have the resources, you kind of band yourself and you block it off. And that's what in Brazil, you give a lot of these, in other societies, you have a lot of these gated communities in the US, of course, too. And in a way, I think that's sort of more of a response of the elite to these potential changes and leaving all the rest outside those walls. Yeah, and this is a part of the story of what's going on in Cambodia now with our research on the dams that are coming online along the Mekong, how that's changing this whole ecological pulse system. It's probably going to, one of the papers we just published in PNAS was about the interconnection between the Mekong and this lake in the middle, which you saw one image of, the Tonle Sap, which is essentially a pulse system that expands and contracts by a factor of about 4, depending seasonally, monsoons and so forth. And that system, we were able to use sediment cores to demonstrate that comes online around 5,000 years ago. We know that, altithermal, it comes online and it connects, and that system begins to expand and contract, and that's precisely when these societies become complex. That's when you see the buildup of population. But now there's a real serious possibility, and that's what we're trying to model, that with the dams that are coming online and the monsoon shifts potentially, all of this, the Mekong is sourced up in the Tibetan Plateau, what is going to happen to that system? Will it shut down? It's quite possible that that pulse system will shut down, which will open up lots of land, it'll desiccate. The Tonle Sap Lake itself is only 3 meters deep and 9 meters in some places, very shallow, but very extensive. But that thing is going to contract. It's going to open up lots of land, and that land is probably going to be captured by agro-industry for a part of time to do plantations, probably rubber or something like that, who knows. And you already see that kind of movement of elites to take over peasant land holdings. And of course, there's no land titles in Cambodia. I mean, they're basically, the archive was lost in the wars, and people now are really kind of squatting in many cases, have no titles, and so they become vulnerable to this kind of political manipulation. And that already is going on. And with changing monsoons, with the dams coming on stream, with the possible shutdown of the pulse system, it's going to cause, I think, as well, major environmental refugees. There are over 1 million people around the Tonle Sap dependent on that lake for fisheries and for agriculture, rice recession agriculture. It's likely they're going to be, and they already are, whole communities I've seen over a decade I've been there are now ghost towns as people migrate to Bangkok, principally to Phnom Penh as well, as this is becoming increasingly both a political and an environmental, environmentally induced abandonment of the landscape. See, I tend to answer questions in large tangential ways, so I maybe not get to the core, but there's so much mutually implicated. It's a problem when you get into this natural social science and environments and humans, it all kind of iterates out and it gets difficult to be precise. Yes?
I have a smaller question. One of your slides showed salt buildup on a field. Was that actually an issue in the decline of agriculture of the salt buildup over time?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We actually tried to test for that in our production system. We put these fields back online. We rehabilitated them over a period of 10 years. And we never had, in that period, it's only a decade, so it's not a huge amount of time, but we never had any reduction in production based on salt wicking at all. Now, I'm not quite sure why that is. I think in part it must be because this is a groundwater regime, so it's principally water that comes up. But there is also were also some canals that linked it that we put online, and it may be that was partly flushing the system. That's what my guess is why we didn't. I was anticipating having salt, and the first thing people see that image, they say, "Oh, well, clearly that's why they collapsed because it's hypersalinated." Sort of like a Mesopotamian story, but it's not that. It isn't that at all, from what we can tell. But so we thought that through. Maybe a partial component of salt wicking, but not anything that affected our production significantly.
So I don't want to stop questions, but I know some of the students probably have other things. You're welcome to get up and go, but
Yeah,
I see
so
Leon had a question, so we're going to continue with the questions, but if people have to get up and go, please feel free to do that.
Yeah, do people make these raised fields these days for agriculture?
Well, it's interesting. You can find raised fields in various parts of the tropics. In Thailand, you find them in Colombia, you find them in different areas. They operate very differently, of course, in different ecological contexts. Here, they really are again, a frost mitigation device as well as, again, addressing this issue of nutrient-poor soils. The short answer is there was a period of time when the Peruvian government in particular, not the Bolivian government, but the Peruvian government really got behind these fields, and they said, here's something that we can use as a contemporary partial development solution for people who have food security problems. And so they did invest in having communities produce on these fields, and there are still raised fields like this in production on the Peruvian side of the lake in particular. Now on the Bolivian side it was a more complicated story. The government never got invested in this. They really were thinking of developing their Beni and their Mojos region, their tropical region, in soy and citrus. So they were looking at this as, why would we care? This is small-scale stuff, even though it isn't. They didn't have the perception of this. And so they simply were not invested in this. And then also in Bolivia, in particular in this area, there was the coca cocaine economy where, we did a quantification of this, on a same hectare of land, if you go into the coca economy, you could you could generate something like $10,000 a year. So on our fields, raised fields, it was minuscule compared to that. So it was an environmental inducement. Go to the go to the Chapari, produce coca, and then also it's a generational story, a story in which the younger generation, they don't want to be farmers. They don't want to be in the Altiplano. They don't want to pursue this. They want to be in the cities. They want to do, become engineers and computer specialists and so forth. So you have, again, many ghost towns in the Altiplano, in the area I worked in, simply towns that are now seasonally or sometimes for ritual occasions, people come back and celebrate, and then they go away. And the demographic curves are very skewed. You have the very old and some of the very young there. The male population is not there. So the short answer is that the fields are viable. They really do produce. Some communities still maintain production, but it is not on the skip it was in the 12th century, when over 100,000, maybe as many as 250,000 hectares of these fields were in production. So it was a real breadbasket, or potato basket, if you will, and now it's mostly abandoned.
And how about the slide that you have shown with women taking the...
Oh yeah, those were our fields.
Those are real, or your...
No, those are our fields. We rehabilitated, we had like 52 communities, and we rehabilitated 250 hectares approximately. In order, we had to scale up because we figured we wanted to know how these fields produce. First of all, the archaeological question is, why up at 3,800 meters did you have an urban society? Most people think, well, that's insane. Why would people, how could you produce food, et cetera? You'd have to import food. So we solved that problem by saying, well, this is the system that did it. And then we did these empirical experiments by rehabilitating the fields and to find out how many, say, index crop potatoes per hectare, how many metric tons could we produce, how many quinoa, all the general Andean crops adapted to high altitude. But we were also able to show, ironically enough, that you could produce lettuce at a high altitude. I didn't have that image here, and that's never heard of. That's that's too cold for that, but we produced it out there. And the local community, it shows you how entrepreneurial people are, decided that they would take that lettuce and they would sell it in the city of La Paz, because the lettuce that was being provided to La Paz came from a totally contaminated lower fields, the Rio Abajo, which was contaminated by effluents from the river. That was textile industries were on it, there were hospitals on it, so it was a biological waste dump. And that was irrigating fields downstream, where you could grow at warmer climates, and that was being brought to the markets in La Paz, and that's what people ate. And so this small group of Aymara women, principally who I worked with, decided they would make biological, organic lettuce from the Altiplano, guaranteed to be pure. They had a hard time convincing people that they weren't just switching lettuce, because you, of course, can't produce lettuce at altitude. They had to bring people up there and show us the fields. So what that shows is how efficacious, how those fields really do work to mitigate frost. And it was, again, I have many of these, to me, charming stories, but frustrating as well. I remember bringing an agent from the Swiss Development Agency out to the fields. And that agency at that time was developing a development intervention in the Altiplano, saying, well, the problem is frost here, nutrient poor soil, and so what do we do about that? Well, we build solar greenhouses. So the idea is they built a lot of these big, huge solar greenhouses with aluminum frameworks and polyethylene sheeting. And they said, oh, well, you can grow strawberries in here now. And there was a big experiment with that. And then within a year, of course, all the strawberries were kind of rust. And I mean, they just were not environmentally well controlled. And I went up there and I talked to him, this Swiss guy, looking at his fields, and right next door were our raised fields. And I said, this is a solar greenhouse over here, only it's at landscape scale. You don't have to invest in this because this is how it works. But even though he saw the lettuce growing there, he said, oh, well, this is indigenous. We need modern technology. So it's a really frustrating thing to say, oh, this is an indigenous solution, but it can't possibly be a solution for the contemporary world. And you can't convince them, you really can't. And there's a World Bank report, which I keep citing word for word. The Altiplano is a marginal environment unfit for intensive cultivation and for human habitation. So it's like, even though people have lived there for multi-generations, thousands of years, large numbers of them, and with health levels that were pretty good, as we can even demonstrate archaeologically, nevertheless, the idea is this is a marginal environment, because it's not the environment that they imagine you can actually occupy and inhabit and make as productive as we were able to show. And even though you bring them there and show you that, they don't see it. This is the frustrating thing of working with development experts. So yeah, it's a story some of you are probably familiar with. Oh yeah.
So the abandonment of the Tiahuanaco fields, they occurred, do you see any spatial pattern, or all the fields were abandoned within the temporal resolution of the...
Within the temporal resolution, yeah. I mean, all abandoned, and that abandonment period is really is about 1150 up through 1200, somewhere, I mean, 50 years, that's about, but it is in our area of study. I mean, we couldn't do the whole basin, but the area we did, which is over 70 square kilometers area, we did multiple trenches. We had 300 some samples, and we dated it, and they're all coming in that area. So it clearly was at that, it wasn't localized, it was like at that, which is the argument we made, that clearly this is a significant impact, you know, that they simply could not keep that system running at that scale. I mean, maybe small scale here or there, spring-driven, perhaps that continued, but not at the scale to support those large populations that had emerged over the 500 years previous when there was the development of this landscape.
50 years so fast, do you think this can argue for a social component of change?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think it isn't all climate-driven. I think it's clear that things weren't looking good over a couple of decades. That's why I referred to the social violence in the city directed at the elites. It's not, you know, they're literally burning the palaces. I mean, that's clearly one of the, oh my God, you know, this is not a good, so I think there was political instability. So it isn't, you know, and you know, some of our papers have been critiqued as if it's environmental determinism. It isn't that really, but we're showing the environmental component. You know, it's the approximate cause, but it isn't the ultimate cause, as it were, because there clearly is a political component to this. But when you see the complete denuclearization or depopulation of the cities, that's just telling you something, and the way the population disperses. And really, one of a pre-industrial case of what I would really argue to be fundamentally environmental/political refugees. Refugeeism is dramatic. And the fact that we can show that on the other side of the Andes, suddenly population expands at that same time. I mean, it doesn't, connecting the dots isn't that difficult. Yeah?
You mentioned the Incan Empire, and I believe Cusco was a Incan center, which is on your map in the same plan there.
Oh, yeah.
So to what extent did the Incan Empire get set off by this disaster? I mean, did these people move to...
Well, you know, that the Inca are later. They actually really appear as an imperial formation in the basically 13th century around Cusco, small scale, but it's not until the 15th century that you, and this is the period where climate is restored. I mean, you don't have this drought. That the drought basically dissipates, if you will, or simply is not. The drought conditions are not there after about I think we got about 1345, somewhere in that range, 1350, mid 14th century. Drought conditions are replaced by some normal. So that really didn't affect the Inca at all. But what you did see is an abandonment of that technology of raised fields. What you find in the Inca period in this area was agricultural terraces. They moved completely to a different agricultural system based on rain-driven terraces rather than groundwater-driven raised fields. Those were abandoned and never reactivated. After 1150 AD, they're not found anywhere. So clearly, it was a cognitive shift, if you will, from groundwater-driven agriculture to terrace, irrigated terrace agriculture. So it doesn't affect the Inca.
Were the Incans the same people or different?
No, Inca, well, I mean, they're interrelated in some sense. There is a case to be made, and I've argued in one of the publications, if you look at linguistics, the Inca language, the court language, there was a secret language that was referred to by the Spanish conquistadors, which was spoken only by the kings and the court, the elites. And that language was clearly Aymara. I mean, there's no question that it was Aymara. In other words, it was from this area of Tiahuanaco, which is the earlier than the Inca. It was an elite royal society, and it may very well be that the the elites were literally of Tiahuanaco 200 years prior, became the ancestors of the elites of Cusco, but the general lingua franca of the Inca Empire was Quechua. It's a different language. I mean, they're related, there's lexical similarities, but they're structurally very different. So it's a different linguistic group, but it may be that the very elites were in fact descendants of the elites of Tiahuanaco after this dispersion and the breakdown of that society. So, I mean, it's a historical linguistic argument that isn't, you know, we can't demonstrate it exactly, but it's a fascinating and potentially interesting coda to what happened to the elites who were directing a society that then fell apart 200 years prior. Yeah.
There've been studies looking at the Inca fields as well, reinvigorating those and finding that they're super productive too.
You mean the terraces?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So reinvigorating
yeah, yeah, yeah.
and Kendall
Right,
stuff.
right. Oh, yeah, and Kendall stuff, sure, absolutely.
So if people were to move to reinvigorating some of their fields now, is one of those better or worse, or are they each suited better to a specific?
Well, I mean, I think, that's the really fascinating thing about the Andes. I mean, those of you who work there, you know that it has such incredible, the Altiplano, people go there. And the first time I went there in '77, so I looked out and said, oh, it looks all about the same. But then I realized, well, no, it's not a monochromatic or monoecological system. And when you go there, and begin to interview people and you look at agricultural systems, one of the earliest persons I met, I came to call the one-man biodiversity team, because it was literally an old guy walking in his fields and he was carrying a shawl or a poncho or a manta, and in that I was I just talked to him, we sat down, we had lunch and shared it, and I asked him, well, what's in there? And he opened it up and he showed me a whole bunch of different seed potatoes. And there were like a whole bunch of them, very different. And I asked him, well, what are you doing carrying all of these different things around? He says, oh, well, I'm just going up to plant fields. And, I asked him, well, why do you have so many different varieties? He said, well, this is something Lonnie and I were talking about just this morning. This guy said, well, up here this potato needs to be planted in this particular context because this is sandy up here and it's drier, and over here it's wetter and I have to put this variety over here, and over here I can do quinoa but not over there. And these are patches. I mean, these are things like the size of this room, and you're talking about going up and down the mountainside, and you begin to realize that, man, these guys really understand that this is incredibly diverse, and edaphic conditions change like 100 meters. They're completely different. And so they know that, and they've adjusted it by adapting and developing these genetic varieties that will thrive in those specific areas. Some are frost resistant in certain environments, some are less frost resistant, so they put them in more protected environments. So that's the high variability of that. But that also then represents, you think, in an agro-industrial landscape, that's why agricultural development agents can't grasp this, because they look at it and they want to do fence post to fence post planting of a single plant, because that's efficient and that's how you get industrial production working, because you can't imagine this kind of patchy mosaic kind of a thing. But that's clearly what goes on in this Andean world, where they know how to push and maximize production, but you need to do it with these highly contextually specific forms of seed crops, and actually agroecological practices are very different. And not only that, ritual practices, which are not trivial, are also very different. You do different kinds of ritual practices for certain fields and not for others, because some is to protect from frost, some is to protect against nematodes, some is to protect against rust. It's very complicated. Again, I'm getting off on tangents, but your question leads me in multiple directions. So there is a high variability, in other words. I don't think one is better than the other. In other words, it depends on what time period, what climatic conditions, what demographic needs there are. All of that, I think, would be part of the things you'd have to search for if you're trying to answer that question. Take into consideration.
All right. Well, let's thank Dr. Kolata. Well,
I don't want to hog time.
Well, I love these questions. I could go on forever, but I appreciate the fact that.
Let's thank Dr. Kolata. And if you have questions, please come up.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.